Loading up, loading up. All right, looks like that is in place. And we'll give it a second for everyone to finish logging in. And because, we don't want to start too early. Oh, and unlike my lunch class, I'm going to remember to turn off the phone. There we go. That
Hi,
way it will not be disturbing. Hey, Aaron, how are you doing?
Good. How about you?
I cannot complain. Getting ready for Shavuot, so, that's always an exciting time.
There's nothing Thursday night, right?
Nothing at our congregation, but we are participating in the Rabbinical Assembly program. And then Friday morning services, Friday night, and Saturday morning services. All right. Well, we've given a 2-minute buffer. Let's go ahead and dive in. We are picking up on chapter 9, Mishnah number 5. And for those of you that are keeping score or looking at the finish line, we are only about 10 Mishnahs plus a little away from the end. That is very, very close. We've already agreed that we're going to be studying Nida next time. That's one of the reasons why we did Mikvah this time. So I don't think we're going to finish tonight because that would be a very fast pace for us. But we could finish next week, maybe the week after. We'll have to see how fast we go. But just trying to give you all a bit of a heads up to make sure you've got your copy of Nida ready for the continuation afterwards. Now, here in Mishnah number 5, we are continuing with talking about things that act as a barrier to the waters of the mikvah. Last time we met, we talked about things that were a barrier on the person between them and the water. And now we are talking about things that are a barrier on an item, that an item might have something on it that is preventing the water from penetrating. Now, as Dr. Kulp says in his introduction, and what's one of the reasons I like his commentary, because it gets us some of the material before we start rather than after the fact, the way the Mishnah presents it. There is a general rule that we're going to talk about. And that general rule is that if you don't want the thing, if you don't want the foreign substance on the thing, then it acts as a barrier. On the other hand, if you don't mind that it's on the thing, that it's just sort of now attached, then it's not a barrier. Now, that's a general rule. There are going to be some exceptions and some qualifications and all sorts of other things. But as a general principle, keep that in mind. If you're planning to remove it eventually, then it's a barrier. If you don't care and you have no intention to remove it, then it's kind of become part of the item. Just keep that in mind as a general principle. Again, it's not 100%, but that will give you an understanding for how we come to the decisions that we get. For example, here in Mishnah 5, in the case of vessels, the following block: pitch and myrrh. So pitch and myrrh are both saps. They're both, well, pitch is not exactly a sap. They're gooey liquids that are very, very clingy, very, very sticky. And they would, of course, block immersion. Now, when we get a special qualification on that in the case of glass. In the case of glass vessels, whether inside or outside. So you might or might not have a preference with regards to the location of that pitch and myrrh for others, but with regards to glass, we want to make sure that our glass is always in good shape. Now, there's a lot of different discussions about glass vis-a-vis its status within the purity structure, of whether glass is treated like earthenware, like sand, and then like clay and terracotta, or whether glass is its own impermeable substance. Here, though, we're not really talking about the glass itself. We are talking about things that could stick to glass. And in the case of glass, really, Only something that is exceptionally sticky, like pitch and myrrh, is going to become an ongoing problem. As such, since glass, as Dr. Culp points out, is something we want to keep clean because it was always expensive, we would assume any pitch and myrrh that attaches to it, which is, again, probably the only substances that could attach, would be removed. And if they're not removed, then immersing glass would not be sufficient. Again, there's more to say about glass within the laws of purity and whether or not it can or cannot become purified or even indeed impure in the first place. But that is for a different class when we talk about the laws of purity in more detail. Here, we're just talking about the barrier issue. Now, as we go on, recognize that it may sound a little odd or perhaps even unhygienic, but I'd like to remind you, one, this is from 2,000 plus years ago, and two, you probably have similar ideas and standards in your own home. Let me explain. On a table or on a board or on a couch, on those that are usually kept clean, they block. On those that are allowed to remain dirty, they do not block. So as Dr. Culp is trying to explain here, that if you spill something on the wood of a table or on a cutting board or even onto a seating type thing, if you are normally fastidious to try and keep it clean, then they are considered barriers between the mikvah water and the item. On the other hand, if I don't really care that it got dirty, then even though it's now gotten dirtier, then it doesn't count as a barrier for the mikvah waters and immerse away. So you may be thinking, like I said, well, how could you possibly have like a dirty, cutting board or butcher block or sofa? But I can guarantee you that almost all of us sit on sofas that have had something drop onto it, crumbs that have been ground into it, some level of blemish, of defilement of food or stains, and there's a certain level that we don't mind. And if it's below that level, then it's okay. And if it gets more than that, then yes, we decide to become a little bit more of a stickler. Now, in the next case, we're going to see an example of how that can be different person to person, not just item to item. They block in the case of beds belonging to householders, but they do not block on beds belonging to a poor person. So in this case, we are making a social or economic distinction, that somebody who is of the means to be able to have a house, which is a little bit nicer than just roughing it or sleeping in a very, very sort of trashy situations, that person probably wants their bed to be clean. Most of us like to lay down in clean beds. Now, does that mean a poor person does not? Does that mean a poor person really doesn't care where they're sleeping? Absolutely not. Of course they do. But it means that a poor person has become accustomed to sleeping in those situations. And as such, the blemishes on their belongings do not become a barrier for any immersion needed in the mikveh. It is not that they don't care at all. It's that they don't care enough to not sleep on it because they have other worries on their mind. Yes, Aaron.
Is there anything about making it easier for a poor person to immerse? For example, if it was very difficult for them to clean their bed enough to immerse, that would potentially prevent them from immersing.
It's an interesting take to see whether or not this is a sort of dispensation on their behalf to make life a little bit easier. But I will say that, in terms of immersion, it's not really that hard. Because even if you don't have access to a regular, mikveh, you can always go to a stream or an ocean, a lake, that kind of thing. The only difficulty here would be trying to remove the blemish from the surface, which would not necessarily be all that hard. It's a question of whether it needs to be done rather than can it be done. It's not like we're asking them to run out and buy a new bed. Same way with the householders. We wouldn't be expecting them to buy a new bed. We would expect them to clean the substance before taking it for immersion.
But would it be hard for a poor person to clean the sheets before immersing it? I mean, I don't know how hard it is to get this stuff off.
That's a good question. I'm afraid I'm not familiar. I know that pitch is rather difficult to work with, as well as any sort of sap. I remember that from my more wildernessy type days. And you get sap and stuff, and yeah, it's a bit of a pain to clean. But everything was kind of a pain to clean back then. You know, you didn't really just have the option of throwing things into a washing machine. So I'm probably not the best person to weigh the relative difficulty that's here to be able to establish if this is purely a poverty legislation. Like I said, I think that it's not so much a dispensation, although it could be, but instead is more about trying to recognize that a poor person has had to make themselves comfortable with sleeping in these poorer conditions because of their status. And then again, to see another case where that is a similar type problem. They block on the saddle of a householder. They do not block on the saddle of a dealer in water skins. So here it's not so much about wealthy or poor, but it's about whether or not it is typical for them or not. A normal householder does not usually get pitch and myrrh on their saddles. Then they would probably feel a little, I don't want to sit on that stuff because it's going to ruin my clothes. But the dealer in water skins, well, they are dealing with all sorts of messy products in any case, often sealed with pitch, for example. As such, if they were going to avoid ever sitting on a saddle that had a substance on it that was nasty, they would never be able to use their saddle or do their job. So we see again that they have made themselves used to it because that's just what you have to do. And as such, for them, it's not a problem. And then one more just caveat on that. They block in the case of a pack saddle. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says only if the stain is as big as an Italian Isar. So a pack saddle is not quite as rough and ready as the normal saddle for these water skins. And so for everyone, we would assume they will block. But Rabban Gamliel is trying, Shimon ben Gamliel is trying to put in a caveat that the blemish has to be at least of a certain size. Now he does get shouted down in the overall argument, but it is trying to introduce the notion that there should be some minimum measure before this is a concern. If it's the size of a fly speck, then is that really a problem? And the short answer is yes, that if it is actually blocking, then it doesn't matter the size, it's a blockage and should be removed before immersion. Now, throughout this conversation, it's a great example of a topic that I know is confusing to many people in the modern world who are used to very, shall I say, a sterile presentation of the law. Many people have, their middle school or high school civics class in their mind, one law for everyone, all are equal under the law, and all of those sorts of adages. And it often creates in the mind a perception that the law is perfectly flat, perfectly sterile. If it's the law for Mr. A, it's going to be the law for Mr. B, going to be the law for Mr. C. And indeed, that is a generally good rule. And in general, the fair adjudication of the law in a way that is consistent for people is an absolutely great ideal, and one that the Torah holds to, repeatedly mentioning that we have one law for everyone in our communities, and one that the rabbis hold to as well. However, that one law does also recognize that the law in many instances is dependent upon the person, meaning it's not the law that is changing, but the person, and that person is a variable in the equation of the law. And as such, we cannot pretend like every person in every situation is exactly the same. And especially in cases like this, where the law is dependent upon the intent, upon the emotion, the feeling, the comfort level of the person who is the variable, then we are going to end up with different decisions. That householder who comes in and says, Rabbi, look at the saddle, is going to get a different answer than the dealer in waterskins who comes in and says, Rabbi, look at the saddle. And the two of them may step outside and they'll each look at the saddle and say, hey, your saddle looks just like mine. Why did you get a different answer? And they need to recognize they got a different answer because they are not the same person. And recognizing that the law will take into account you as a variable, that your own intention, your own self is an important element in the law being decided and applied, is an important step in recognizing that halakha is not arbitrary, it is not distant, it is not ancient and unmoving and unthinking or uncaring, but that halakha is an application of Torah that fits each of us like a glove. Questions or comments before we move on to 6? Okay, so we are still talking about these stains and other sorts of issues, and now we're moving to clothing. On clothing, if on one side only, meaning the stain or mark is only on one side, they do not block, but if found on two sides, they do block. So if you have a stain that it's just on the outside or just on the inside, and it's only visible from one side, then that's not considered to be the type of stain that the average person is is going to be upset about to the point that they want to remove it and thus would be considered a blockage. On the other hand, if the stain is significant enough that it has penetrated one side and come out the other side, then yes, the average person is going to want to remove that in order to make their clothes look better. Again, we have to remember that for most of the average people, they did not have multiple sets of clothes, and they didn't have an easy way to replace clothes that were no longer usable. And so their standard of what was considered a acceptable level of cleanliness may have been, quote, lower than ours, or if you wish to flip it, their tolerance for what was an acceptable level of schmutz without wanting to waste or destroy something might have been higher than ours, depending upon how you want to look at it. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Ishmael on one side also, meaning that actually we could argue that it works even only on one side. However, Rabbi Yossi is going to give a different interpretation here, saying that in the case of builders, they block if on one side, but in the case of ditch diggers, only if on both sides. Now, this is a passage which has a couple of different interpretations. So let's go with the simplest explanation, which is what Dr. Kolp uses, which is the idea that the builders are sort of standard level of fastidiousness, and for them, that if they block on one side, they might be uncomfortable and want to remove it because they want to look a little better. However, the ditch diggers in this particular version, they would be more comfortable with a lot more schmutz, and the only way that they would actually say, let's go change it, is if it is on both sides. Now, before we get to an alternative explanation of reading this much more metaphorically, Aaron, do you have a question?
Yes, Rabbi. Is this based on societal norms that the average person, for some reason, doesn't care if there's a stain on the outside of his clothes, but does care if it's on the inside or on both sides?
Right. So it's not just inside versus outside. It's one side versus two sides. So it could be on the inside and he doesn't care. It could be on the outside, he doesn't care. But on both sides, now he cares. And indeed, this is really telling us something about the societal norms of what people were comfortable with, or not necessarily like okay with, but at what level were they concerned enough to actually take the steps to remove it. And if they weren't going to remove it, then that means it's part of the clothing. And of course, like I said, they also would not have had an easy way to remove, so their tolerance would have been higher than most of our tolerances, because They didn't really have an easy choice. They didn't have another option to just throw it in and throw in the detergent and turn it on for the wash cycle. It meant, scrubbing it clean, bare hands, and doing what you could. So yeah, this is definitely reflecting part of the societal norms. And I always love these episodes because it gives us that glimpse into what was life like during the late Second Temple period, and then onward into the Mishnaic period. What sort of things would you expect to see if you were just walking through town? And this gives us a little bit of a glimpse of that.
So, Rabbi, this could potentially be fixed by sewing a patch over the stain then.
Well, it would be more likely fixed by removing the offending part and sewing a patch in its place. If something was completely uncleanable, then you would just cut out that stain, put a patch in, and then sew the patch over. Now, patches back then were a little bit easier to do than they are now. We're talking, by and large, homespun wool that's been run through a loom. There would have been rather heavy and coarse fibers for many types of clothing. And as such, reweaving through a patch would have been much more possible, and it would have left a better result. I mean, if I try to, cut out a patch on my shirt and reweave these tiny little threads, there's little chance you're just going to end up with a big knotted mess, even if I was good at that type of sewing. But back then, that would have been much easier for people to sort of reweave some of the fabric right back into it. So yeah, patches were the more ready to go solution if necessary. Okay, but let's take this into metaphor world, where we have our builders as being the metaphor for the Talmidei Chachamim, for the scholars, and our ditch diggers as the bor, as being those that are uneducated and uncouth. So then we see a different sort of perspective, that somebody that is a student of Torah, and by this they meant an official Talmid Chacham, somebody that was an actual category of dedicated to learning Torah in order to elevate themselves and be a service to their community, that such a person has not only their own dignity to worry about, but also the dignity of Torah, which they can sometimes represent. Now, is that fair? In the modern world, we worry about that a lot more. But back then, if you were at all likely to be seen as a symbol of the Torah or of Judaism, then you had to work off that assumption that when people looked at you, they were judging your actions as being indicative of what a Torah life was supposed to be. In the modern world, this would be the example of if you are, wearing something that identifies you as being Jewish, then you should be aware that other people will be judging Jews and Judaism by your behavior. They won't only be judging you. As such, it is understood that a person who is a Talmid Chacham, and also even more so a rabbi, should always be very careful about their appearance in order that they not cause people to disparage the idea of Torah. On the opposite side, the unlettered, the uneducated, the ignorant, and here we mean willfully ignorant, they don't care very much what they're wearing at all, because they are kind of, scuzzy in that worldview. So two very different ways to understand this. Both of them are still trying to teach that basic idea, though, about, as you mentioned, Aaron, the societal norms that they are operating inside. Questions before we move on to 7? Okay. They do not block, meaning even these very sticky substances, in the case of aprons belonging to workers in pitch, potters, or trimmers of trees. And Rabbi Yehuda says the same applies to summer fruit dryers. So here we get it very clear. If you are a worker who works in pitch, or you are a potter, or you are dealing with tree sap all the time, or even just sticky fruit, then you know what? Your apron is going to get messed. And that means that no matter how dirty it gets, it's part of the apron. It's not a foreign substance that is blocking the immersion waters from doing their job. So we go all the way from, even minor things could be a problem in the case of glass, all the way up to nothing is going to be a problem for these aprons. Whatever gets stuck to it, it's just part of the apron now because that's the apron doing its job. So we've seen kind of an entire spectrum of different ideas on that whole in that whole range of concept. And then finally, we get to the general rule, which was paraphrased by Dr. Culp at the beginning. This is the general rule. If it is something which one cares to remove, it blocks. But if it is something which one does not care enough to remove, it does not block. And again, that's a good general rule, although sometimes we have to investigate to double check the person as well as the object to make that determination. Questions before we dive into Mishnah number 10? Okay, just reseat myself, refuel the tea, and now talk about immersion of items in general. So in order for an item to be immersed, we have to conceive of what is an item. I know that sounds very philosophical, but if I hold up my mouse, that's not going to show up. Yes, if I hold up my mouse, is this one item or is this the sum of all of its parts? And that makes a difference for when I go to immerse something. If it is only one item, then I can just immerse the item. If it is multiple items, then I will have to disassemble the item and immerse the constituent parts, because the water needs to reach every point of an item. If there is two items that are bumping against each other, then the water is not touching in between where their surfaces meet. If it is one item, then even though there are elements of that item that might be hidden from view, as we'll see here in the case of handles, that doesn't mean that it's a problem. And even if the water will not reach it, it's not a problem because it is one contiguous item. So what is our first case in this topic? Well, 10.1, any handles of vessels which have been fixed not in their usual manner, or if fixed in their usual manner have not been fixed firmly, or if fixed firmly have been broken, they block. All right, so take, for example, a hammer. So classic hammer construction, you have a metal head of the hammer, and then you have the wooden handle of the hammer. And the wooden handle of the hammer is inserted into a hole in the top of the head. Usually a wedge is driven into that wooden handle from the top. It pushes the handle to the side, and that means it becomes firmly bound into the hammer itself. Basic hammer 101 construction. Well, if I take a hammer and rather than doing the normal way of sticking it together properly and wedge and all of that good stuff, I just, wrap a couple bits of string around it. And I say, that's good enough. Let me go to the Mikvaot. Not so fast, because that's not actually binding stick and head together into hammer. Now you've just got a stick bumping against a head and both of them wrapped in some string. As such, they're blocked. And that means that the water would not touch all of their points and they would not be able to successfully be immersed. In the same way, if you did it the normal way, I take my hammer or my handle, I put the hammer on top, I put a wedge into it, but I do kind of a shoddy job. So it's not really connected and it's a bit loose and wiggly and all that other good stuff. Then again, that is not going to make them into one item. And as such, when it comes time to immerse, they would be counted as two, and two touching together or blocking, and that means it's not effective. And likewise, if I take my hammer, but the handle has been broken off, sure, it was a perfectly valid hammer, but now the handle is broken, which means the handle is no longer a handle. Now it is a piece of broken wood attached to the hammer, attached to the hammer head. And as such, it's going to be blocking, and the hammerhead blocking it for that matter. Aaron, your hand is up.
Yeah, brief question. In the string example, the string would block too, right?
Yes, indeed. The string would also block. I was trying to come up off the top of my head of how would you attach a hammerhead in the non-usual manner, and that was the version. I suppose you could come up with some other options, stick it with bubble gum. But that's the whole point, is that if it's an unusual manner, then you're not really making a hammer. You're just making a hammer-like object. Okay. Now, that hopefully was fairly clear. Now we need to get a little bit more imaginative of what does it look like when you've got a pot, when you have a kettle, when you've got an item that you need to shove into the water. And hopefully all of you at some point in your life have played at the beach, in the pool, or even in a bathtub with different cups and shapes and all sorts of things, and learned about water displacement and the air being trapped in them and all that other good stuff, because we need that knowledge going forward. The Mishnah here is very, very practical, pragmatic, and based off empirical experience. If a vessel was immersed with its mouth downwards, it is as though it had not been immersed. Okay, I take a glass. I turn the glass upside down. I shove the glass into the mikvah and it goes under the water. Hooray, I've done nothing. Because as we know from air pressure, when it goes in, there's going to be a big air bubble inside the glass, and the water is going to come up a little bit, but it is not going to reach the bottom of the glass, which is now upside down, because the air bubble will block it. As such, you've done nothing. And much of what we're going to see in the next couple of cases here are dealing with that air pocket problem, that water doesn't just go everywhere if there is air in the way. Air pressure pushes back on the water coming in. Okay, so obviously then we would need to immerse it with the top up so that the water can flow in, go all the way around it. Wonderful, that's what we need. However, if immersed in the regular matter, but without the attachment, it becomes clean only if turned on its side. Okay, so here we have a, let's imagine like a kettle, which is probably the easiest thing for us to imagine. They had many other types of devices they would have used that has a little bit of an attachment, some sort of spout, spigot, pipe that is coming out to the side of the item, and it is in some way, shape, or form able to be turned in some way that it is, if you put it in normally, it might still trap the air. Again, think of perhaps a kettle where, because of the bend in the neck of the kettle, at the top of that bend, if you put it straight down, then there's going to be an air pocket at the top. Okay, so it only becomes cleaned then if you turn it on its side. So it goes in, you turn it on its side, now the water will penetrate into that attachment, and you will actually be sure that the water has gotten everywhere. Make sense? Great. I know we're doing hydraulic engineering. If a vessel is narrow at each end and broad in the center, it becomes clean only if turned on its side. So again, because of the way it is shaped, in order to make sure that the water indeed fills all of the cavity in the middle of that vessel, then by turning on its side, we ensure that the water can make sure it goes everywhere. Again, pretty straightforward. Now we get something which is not as straightforward for most of us. So the best example I could come up with was a sort of a modern ketchup bottle. If you've ever had a ketchup bottle and you're trying to squeeze out the last drop, you know that there is a sort of lip on the inside of most modern ketchup bottles that traps the last bit of ketchup, and that you can pry off the top and try and dig around with a knife, but it's really, really hard to get everything in there out, because there is a like inverted top, and because it's inverted, there become these little cavities that can trap the substance. Well, if it can trap substance, it can also trap water. It can also trap air. Now, why would they have used these? Well, of course, this would have been a way of trying to partly help catch any debris as you're like drinking or pouring out of it that might get caught in this little lip. And that would, make it easier to have things that came out cleaner. But this is a problem when you go to the mikvah, because when you go to the mikvah, you put it in, even if you turn it around, even if you shake it, well, there's still a very high chance that there is a little ring of air trapped inside the downturn mouth of the pot, and that means that the water hasn't gotten everywhere. What is the solution? A flask which has its mouth turned inward becomes clean only if a hole is made at the side. In the area that's coming down, you need to drill a hole into the wall of the flask, so that now there is a little way for the water to enter into that rimmed area underneath the intern mouth. Does that make sense? Okay. And apparently this was a similar technique that was used for an ink pot. An ink pot of layman becomes clean only if a hole is made at its side. So again, the ink pot of layman were often made in the same kind of way, and you needed to have an extra little hole to make sure that it would allow the water to come in when it goes into the mikvah. The ink pot of Joseph the priest, Joseph HaKohen, had a hole at its side. This is one of those attestations saying, indeed, this was a thing. This is not just hypothetical. We actually do have a tradition that here is another person that did follow this type of procedure. So that means, extra points for this opinion, because clearly it was a procedure that was followed. Questions or comments? I know after all of the wrestling and wrangling with different concepts throughout the whole Masechet, it actually gets a little easier near the end. But that's also the reward of working hard in studies, because you understand all the underlying concepts much better than at the beginning. Mishnah 10:2. A bolster, which is like a type of pillow, and a cushion of leather, it is necessary that the water enter inside of them. Okay, what are we talking about here in Mishnah 2? Well, we are talking about some objects are inside and out, and some objects are just outside. And we need to tell the difference, because when it comes to the mikvah, if it's something that has an inside and outside, like a pot, like a glass, then the water has to go everywhere, inside and out. On the other hand, if it is something that only has an outside, and we'll get a few examples in a minute, then we don't have to have the water penetrate to the inside. If it's inside, it's inside. Just like when we talked about our hammer example a little while ago, that space that is between the wall of the handle and the wall of the hammerhead, that's inside, and you don't have to worry about the water getting in there in order to make the item pure. Just like you don't have to worry about the water penetrating to the innermost layer of wood before it's considered rendered pure. The water touches all of its surface, you're fine. Okay, well, we've just learned that if it's these types of cushions and pillows, well, a person would routinely take things out, restuff them, and wash them. And thus, when you go to the mikveh, you need to make sure that the water can go inside and out. However, a round cushion, for some reason, or a ball, or a bootmaker's last, I learned from studying this, is the model that they would make the shoe around. So think of it like a mannequin, a foot, or the dummy for a tailor, or an amulet, or a phylactery. It is not necessary that the water enter inside of them. And by phylactery, yes, they mean tefillin. So these are all objects that in their culture at their time were never opened up again. So you would have this amulet, and that would be made, it would be sealed and done. Just like tefillin, you make it, you seal it up, it's done. And a ball, well, just like nowadays, you don't take your baseball and unsew it every day and then, restuff it or anything. Once you've made it and sewn it up, it's done. And apparently they had a certain type of round cushion that was also a when it's done kind of cushion. So these are things that you don't open up. You don't remove the interior of them. You don't check the interior of them all that often. So even though they could be opened, it's not hard to open up a baseball, as I have done in my misspent youth. When it's not being opened, we treat it as a singular solid object, and we only have to worry about the outside. And we even get a general rule. Oh, this is the general rule. Any article, the filling of which is not usually taken out and put in, may be immersed unopened. If you don't open it up and close it all the time, or just even regularly, then it's a single object. Drop it in the mikvah without worrying about getting it open. Questions or comments? Okay, with that in mind, we now turn to Mishnah 3, where we are going to continue with the idea of, well, there are some things that you just don't have to worry about whether the water gets in them. You only have to make sure the water gets on them. For example, knots in the clothes of a poor man, or in tassels, or in the thong of a sandal, or in head tefillin if it is fastened tightly, or in an arm tefillin if it does not move up or down, or in the handles of a water skin, or in the handles of a wallet. So these are all things that, when knotted, they can technically be unknotted, but they usually are not unknotted unless something has broken. So the knots in the clothes of a poor man, this is to go back to our discussion of mending clothes. When you would re-sew or reweave something, you would knot in those extra pieces and patches and not the edges. Well, if you were poor and repairing your clothes like that, you were not taking it apart, reattaching it, taking it apart, reattaching it. You were knotting it and hoping for the best so that it wouldn't break. Likewise, for the tassels at the hem of clothing, you knotted those when you finished with the cloth, and you did not expect to ever untie them ever. The tassels on my talit have been there since I was 16, and I have no intention of actually undoing them. Mind you, this is not tzitzit. These are the extra threads that sometimes will get knotted at the edge of cloth. Head tefillin. Here we are talking about the knot on the head tefillin, and that knot that's tied up at the back. Well, if you fastened it tightly, then it's usually one and done. Maybe if you change your hairstyle, but generally speaking, once you're an adult, your head isn't changing size all that often, and as such, that knot is not being loosened and retightened with any regularity. Likewise, the arm tefillin, as long as it is properly secured, this is not something that needs a lot of extra work. And apparently the handles of a water skin and the handles of a wallet, likewise, were something that once you tied the knots to hold it together, it was done. Even though it is only tied to an object, even though it is only attached with knots, it is still considered part of the object. And as such, we don't have to worry about whether the water can penetrate through the knot into the centerpiece of the different, leather or string that is inside of the knot itself. Not every surface of the leather or string or wool is going to be exposed to the water, but that's okay for these types of knots. Make sense? All right, just let Dr. Kolb get his commentary up here. Okay. Now, on the contrary, let's talk about things that you absolutely need to let water get into them. The following require that water shall enter inside them: the knot in an undergarment, which is tied to the shoulder; the hem of a sheet must be stretched out; the knot of head tefillin if it is not fastened tightly, or of the arm tefillin if it moves up and down; and the laces of a sandal. Clothes which have been immersed when they have, actually, let's do that list first, and then we'll get to the clothing issue. So all of these knots in their culture, in their type of usage, would be knots that were loose enough that they were not done, or they are the type of knot that would be done and undone on a regular basis. So these all needed to be either loose enough to let the water go through, or simply undone so entirely, so that the water would have no, there would be no doubt of whether or not the water would touch all of the surface area. Now, clothes is a nice, interesting issue. Clothes which are immersed when they have just been washed must be kept immersed until they bubble up. So a couple of different ways of explaining this bubbling up, but if you've ever put clothes into water, whether it's like washing them in the sink or messing around in the swimming pool, you'll know that oftentimes when you first put clothes into the water, there is some amount of air that is still trapped and some amount of buoyancy in the liquid, buoyancy in the fabric, because it is lighter than the liquid. It has not been fully soaked. In the first half of this section, however, clothes which have just been washed, well, we assume that they are washed, and that means that they are still wet. And because they are wet, when we put them into the mikvah water, then as long as they are mostly in, then we're okay. Even if some of it is bubbled up over the top of the mikvah, even if we think there might still be some air trapped in them, that's fine, because the water that is throughout the fabric from being washed joins with the water that is in the mikvah. Remember, we saw before that the water in the mikvah can defy gravity, that its status can travel up even to the person standing in the water who has water on their surface. They are considered part of the mikvah, the waters that are on the surface of that person. Well, here too, the water that is inside of this fabric that's been washed is considered part of the mikvah, even if it doesn't seem entirely immersed in the normal way. However, but if they are immersed when already dry, they must be kept immersed until they throw up bubbles and then cease to bubble up. So this time we need to actually soak them in the mikvah and then make sure that it is done billowing and puffing and letting air bubbles out and all of that. That we need to make sure that it is soaked through and through, or else the water hasn't reached all of the fabric. We're worried about air pockets and such. Make sense? Okay. Hearing no objections, so moved. Let's just get Dr. Culp up here for people that are going to hit pause, because that's helpful. Of course, you can always go to Safaria and read along, and even keep my my voice in the background, but it's fine to look at this more easily on your own device rather than on the video. Anyway, Mishnah number 5. Any handles of vessels which are too long and which will be cut short need only be immersed up to the point of their proper measure. Rabbi Yehuda says they are unclean until the whole of them is immersed. Okay, so we haven't gone through the whole issue of kilayim, of utensils, but there is a general principle within the rabbinic understanding that if you have an item, let's go back again to our hammer idea, and you put a hammer, you put a piece of wood into the hammer and you attach it, but that piece of wood is 20 feet long. Well, that is too long for a hammer handle. You just attached it because that was the length of pole you had available. And then once you attached it, you're going to cut it short. Well, if you haven't cut it short yet, but you're going to cut it short because you've got too much handle attached to it, much longer than would be normally used, then when you dip it in the mikvah, you don't have to dip all 20 feet of the handle. You only need to immerse it up to the point of the proper measure of what a handle should be. And indeed, in other parts of the Mishnah, they talk about how long an average handle for different types of utensils would be. So the chiddush, the novelty here, is that even though it is attached to a much, much longer handle, most of that 20 feet is not actually handle. It is just extra wood that it may be attached to the item, in this case, the hammerhead, but it's not actually part of the hammer. The hammer itself is much shorter. It just is, at the moment, connected. And as long as you dip up to the point where the hammer should be, you're fine. And then to give another example of that, the chain of a large bucket to the length of 4 handbreadths. All right. And for a small bucket to the length of 10 handbreadths. And they need only be immersed up to their point of their proper measure. So here we have a bucket. Buckets very often have chains attached to them, which become basically part of the bucket contraption. Again, going back to our what makes a mouse, right? The chain is part of the bucket. It's not separate from the bucket, even though it had to be attached. But then, so did the handle and so did the bottom of the bucket. That's how things get made. And the chain for a large bucket is assumed to be 4 handbreadths long. And the chain for a small bucket is assumed to be much longer, because you can pull it more from a longer distance, because it won't hold as much weight. And even though the chain that is currently attached is much longer for either, when we immerse it, it only has to go down to that 4 handbreadth or 10 handbreadth depth. And then when we pull it out, we can cut off the chain, and we are left with a immersed item that went in up to the point of their proper measure. Makes sense? Rabbi Tarfon adds a little caveat, which gets shouted down, but he says it's not clean unless the whole of the chain ring is immersed. So he's saying, yes, but let's be clear that if it is 4 tefachim at the middle of a link, then you need to actually go up until the link is all the way in. You can't do it part way. Now he loses this argument because, again, the issue here is what actually is considered part of the vessel. And it's only part of the vessel up till 4 tefachim. And that means that's it. So it's not about the link, it is about the length. And then one more example, and then we'll probably finish here for tonight. The rope bound to a basket is not counted as a connection unless it has been sewn on. So if you just tie a rope to a basket, well, that's not the way we normally attach a rope to a basket. The way we normally attach a rope to a basket, because they're made out of the same kind of weaving techniques, is to sew it into the basket. As such, you can lower that rope together with the basket into the mikvah, but the rope is considered extra. It is considered a barrier. It is blocking the mikvah waters from reaching the basket, and the basket blocking the mikvah waters from reaching the rope, and that means nothing has been done. If you sew the rope into the basket, well, now it's one item, and we don't have to concern ourselves of whether the water has penetrated inside the stitching, because it is one item. We only are concerned with the surface. Yes, Aaron.
Is this kind of similar to how they said that you need the ring chain attached to the chain? The basket ring? Because if you just put the basket ring on, is that kind of like just tying the rope to the basket if you don't use the chain ring to the bucket?
You mean the issue here with Rabbi Tarfon, or do you mean in general?
With Rabbi Tarfon, where it talks about the chain ring is immersed too. So if you don't have a chain ring, do you run into the same problem you have by just tying the rope to the basket? Is the same problem you have just tying the chain to the bucket?
Not exactly, because here chain ring is not about the attachment point to the bucket. It is about the end of the chain, the loose end. And you know how chains are made out of links. The issue is, does the top link have to go completely into the water or not? And that's the issue, because we know we're gonna cut the link above it, but this one in the middle, in Rabbi Tarfon's opinion, if it is halfway the right length, just through the middle of that link, then maybe we should have to submerge it all the way through that link. But this is talking about the loose end of the chain, not the attachment point on the bucket end.
I was wondering what that meant.
Yeah, I'm not sure why Dr. Kolb used the phrase chain ring, because I mean link is the more normal English word for that that item, and that probably would have helped. All right, so we have gotten up to Mishnah 10.5. We'll do 10.6 and on through the end next week. I can guarantee you we'll finish next week now. Like I said, this is pretty straightforward stuff, so I'm glad we made good time. And we will wrap up our mikvah study next week, and then the following week we'll begin with Nida. So take care, everyone. Be well, and an early Chag Sameach, so that you have a wonderful Shavuot.